Welcome, woefully mediocre viewers, to the show where we won't answer your burning questions like, does the Batmobile run on a bat battery or just a battery? Welcome to Cartoon Gateway, the show where I talk about the average trials and tribulations of a cartoon fan. I'm your host, David Hollander. We all have our favorite shows, our favorite cartoons. I have 3 favorite cartoons of all time: Spectacular Spider-Man, Futurama, and Transformers Prime. And to put that into perspective, I have just 4 favorite shows of all time. I'll let you figure out what non-cartoon wormed its way in there. Time's up. And with those favorite shows come favorite characters. You can't love a show without some attachment to the main characters. No one would watch The Simpsons anymore unless they had Stockholm Syndrome and just believed their lives would be threatened if they didn't pay attention to Lisa. But the main cast for a show can only do so much, so where's the rest of the mileage in a show? Well, the villains, but I kinda did an episode about that already. Check it out if you haven't. That's where side characters come in. The side characters of Family Guy have spent so long carrying the show that Joe can't walk anymore. My legs! A side character can often be the one thing keeping people watching an otherwise failing show. So what happens when a side character gets so popular they get promoted? It's the futile middle-class dream, becoming so important because you did more work, and instead of just being rewarded with more work, you get a new position of importance. This has resulted in some strange things happening in various cartoons. Sometimes an entirely new character shows up and basically takes over the show. Sometimes an old character can find their true potential in this way. So what are some of the more interesting cases of a cartoon character getting what they deserve, which is to say, a chance? There's a lot to talk about, and let's just get the most obvious example out of the way: the spin-off. A character gets so much attention that they get shipped off to their own box to remain in purgatory, where they'll inevitably be overshadowed by their source material. That doesn't sound like a reward, does it? It sounds more like one of those stories about bad blood behind the scenes of your favorite 90s sitcom. Oh, sure, when America sends all of its black characters to a different place, it's a civil liberties crisis, but when Family Guy does it, it's just a Cleveland show. I jest, of course, but you can see how a spin-off is a double-edged sword, right? They basically never end up being as popular as the original, and if it is, you get the case where the spin-off completely eclipses the original. Either way, something ends up overshadowed. And this isn't exactly what I'm talking about when I say a side character gets promoted. I mean when a side character goes from being a footnote to being important enough to become a central part of the show. Though I do think spin-offs are worth talking about in that conversation. Contrary to my joke from before, I do believe that making Cleveland the subject of the one Family Guy spin-off was the right call. The writers recognized that he wasn't contributing much to the show at the time, so they aren't really losing anything by taking him somewhere else. But paradoxically, because he was so insubstantial, he effectively had the most room to grow and a show all of his own. Whether or not that panned out is a story for another day, but worth mentioning. But like I said, we're talking about when a side character becomes important in a way they weren't before. Writers can do interesting things with a character that was otherwise a blank slate, or by doing something new with someone who hadn't been that important. Not a cartoon, but The Muppet Show did that all the time. That was my 4th favorite show from before, by the way. Never tell me that I need to diversify my media palette. I watched The Muppet Show. So let's look at some of those examples. By no means a comprehensive list, here are some major or interesting examples of side characters becoming more integral parts of their shows. Adventure Time has a few interesting examples of this, but I talked about some of them before. Debatably, an example is Marceline, since she started as a one-dimensional villain who became more nuanced as the show went on. But that's not quite what I'm talking about, partly because Marceline was still important even when she was just a villain. But then you get examples like Cinnamon Bun, a guy who started as a joke character who became what I can only call the ultimate Chad over the course of the show. Men, look at this image. There will always be a man greater than you, and he is a cinnamon bun. Then there's the Elements miniseries, where the near-apocalyptic destruction of the entire world was averted thanks to Lumpy Space Princess. The wacky, shouty character voiced by the show's creator became the literal key to stopping the end of the world. This kind of thing can be used to surprise the audience. I guarantee no one predicted LSP would save the world. But going back to Marceline, this kind of thing can happen to villains too, provided that those villains are unimportant or cannon fodder. Ninjago has a few good examples of this, one of my favorites being Captain Soto. Early in season 2, a bunch of pirates showed up out of nowhere as one-episode guest characters, and they were gone in an instant. Weird, but the second season was littered with instances like that. The writers really did take the tell the audience we haven't been told where the show was going without telling them we haven't been told where the show is going challenge. Cut to the show's 6th season, where the main villains were the Sky Pirates, a bunch of steampunk-themed pirates led by a wish-granting djinn. Whoever thought of that needs a raise. It's the animation industry, no one's getting paid enough, but this person especially. And our heroes need to know more about these guys, and how to defeat them, and who steps out of the woodwork with the exact information they need. Captain Soto really went from a throwaway villain to an important part of the show's best season. I will fight you on a balcony if you wish to argue that last point, by the way. Skybound is the best season, and I'm tired of pretending it's not. But not to discredit newer seasons of the show, Ninjago Dragons Rising even does this. You know, the new show. Dorama, this bedazzled magician-looking guy, went from a one-episode guest villain to part of the main cast of enemies. I personally haven't seen it yet, so please no spoilers, but it looks like they're doing the same thing with Jordana, however that manifests. But my favorite example from the new show thus far is Raptin. Without wishing to spoil stuff, Raptin went from my most begrudgingly tolerated aspect of the show to my favorite villain of the season in the span of 5 episodes. But let's change the subject to something you probably know more about than friggin' Ninjago. One of the most famous examples of a background character becoming integral to the show would be Butters from South Park. You wouldn't think it today, but there was a time that Butters was completely vestigial, just a background role that could be played by anyone in the show. He didn't even have a name for a huge chunk of the show's run. He was just the blonde kid with the cyan jacket. It's not aquamarine. That color has a little green in it. Sky blue makes no sense because the sky isn't always that blue. Learning cyan has been a lifesaver, by the way. I mean, though I guess on second look, the jacket has a little green in it, just a twinge. I don't know what's real anymore. Goodbye, reality, you won't be missed. But back on track. Butters was nothing but a crowd filler, no more significant than any other kid in the crazy little town of South Park. Even by the time of South Park Bigger, Longer, and Uncut, the friggin' movie that single-handedly killed Kyle as a baby name, and Butters was a complete and total footnote at the time. He only barely had a name by this point. So why did Butters become a prominent character? Well, it started as an in-joke, based off the show's lead animator, who talked basically exactly like him, you know, bit of a stammer, kind of a pushover, but remarkably friendly guy. Matt Stone and Trey Parker started calling him their little buddy, their little Butters, and eventually they just came up with Butters and thought it'd be funny to have a character in the show to reference their little in-joke. They then picked the character model for Butters out of a crowd and said that one, like adoption. And that's how Butters got his personality. As he appeared more and more, he became a fan favorite. Then as the show went on, they decided they didn't really like Pip. So they decided instead of keeping a character nobody liked around, to get rid of him and basically elevate Butters to the role previously played by Pip. And the rest is history. Look, if you want a more in-depth look at Butters' history and development as a character, I recommend the video essay done by Johnny Tuchelos. I don't normally give shoutouts to other content creators, but when one is so much better at this specific task than me, I sort of have to. I don't have time to give Butters his very own episode. This guy did, and it's a delight. Check it out if you're really interested. There's also examples of the opposite happening. For instance, Mort from Bob's Burgers. Mort's role as the mortician next door was initially a lot more important than the original concept for the show. I won't waste your time with that, if you know, you know. But as the show's gone on, since he wasn't as integral as the writers thought he'd be, he appeared less and less. I know, off topic, but worth mentioning since the opposite can happen to anyone. Even characters who've been around since the pilot of a show. Then sometimes a writer just gets super attached to a character, and this is not a phenomenon limited to just cartoons. Why do you think the Dinobots keep showing up in new Transformers shows? Or why Deadpool became the most popular X-Men character? Or why Scorpion's been on the cover of so many Mortal Kombat games even when he's barely in them? A writer or someone behind the scenes just gets really attached to a favorite character and thus ensures their popularity. Not an insult either. Yeah, Simon Furman, if you ever see this, you're a great writer, you've just got some obvious favorites. But I'm not complaining because the Dinobots are awesome. This also extends to cases where a show or piece of media tries to force a character's popularity, like Cable in the X-Men franchise, or Rogu in American Dad. And Rogu's probably the one example of that kind of thing that actually worked, and even then, that's highly debatable depending on who you ask. One of the more interesting cases in the 2010s was Regular Show, which had multiple instances throughout. Debatably, most of the main cast of the show started in background roles. The only two that were arguably essential were Skips and Benson. Muscle Man and High Five Ghost were rivals to Mordecai and Rigby, but they were funny and became more bro-like as the show went on. Pops was the most insubstantial of the lot, and he ended up pulling an LSP and saving everything in the universe. Though to a more specific extent, there's CJ. She started as a one-episode guest character before becoming Mordecai's love interest for a time, before he, I'm not talking about this a third time in a row. Look, we all know what Mordecai did to fumble this, but if you want the biggest example in the show, I present Eileen. I want to put into perspective the meteoric rise of this character because it can't be understated how miraculous it is. In that first season and a chunk of the second, it seemed like the writers really had no interest in using Eileen beyond just that girl with a crush on Rigby who Rigby doesn't like for some reason. She was just Margaret's friend, showing up whenever Margaret did. And even then, Margaret regularly appeared without her. Then, over the course of 5 seasons, Eileen slowly, almost imperceptibly, went from a wallflower to Rigby's actual love interest. And beyond that, Eileen started getting getting spotlight episodes all her own. Entirely in the background, Eileen became a central part of Rigby's story, to the point where she became part of the main cast outright for the final season. Starla didn't even get that honor, and she was married to Muscle Man at the time. That effectively made Eileen the main female lead of the show. Ashamed to admit she didn't have that much to do in the main cast in that final season, one of the show's only missed opportunities, if you ask me, but still. It's wildly impressive that Eileen stayed that important for a majority of the show. But there's one show I think of above all else when it comes to side characters becoming more substantial, more fleshed out, and more significant parts of the show. That would be The Amazing World of Gumball. Anyone who was there when this show first began could tell you it was a very different show starting out, and as a symptom of that, the characters by the end were a lot different than what they were in the beginning. As the show slowly found itself, their side characters found themselves too. There's plenty of examples of side characters becoming more significant in the show, and often in various different ways. I've got 4 examples I'm going to share today, just to show a variety of ways a side character may become vastly different. The first one, not the most notable, but still worth talking about, would be Hot Dog Guy. This dude was the definition of a footnote, to the point where he shared a design with 2 other characters, and you wouldn't even know that these 3 weren't the same guy unless the wiki told you. Then came the episode The Hug, where Hot Dog Guy became the center of one of the show's most recurring cringe humor gags. His entire existence centered around being awkward around Gumball. Yeah, important? Not really in the grand scheme of things, but this did make Hot Dog Guy one of the most memorable side characters in the show, and it took several seasons for that to be the case. Okay, yeah, Hot Dog Guy. Yeah, maybe I should have started with someone else. Like Carrie. I probably should have started with her, because her gradual promotion as the show went on is incredibly impressive. Who is Carrie? A ghost, emo girl, and that's about it, at least from the outset. She was just a background character at Elmore Junior High, one of the most commonly recurring in the school, but they had a small number of recurring students starting out, especially with the show's budget at the time. There was clearly something special about Carrie from the beginning, and that mostly had to do with her being a ghost, allowing more potential with the stories they could tell. She was one of the only student characters to get a spotlight episode in season 1. The only other characters to receive that treatment in the first season were Penny, Gumball's love interest, Tina and Tobias, both as antagonists, and Bobbert, who I assume was singled out for the same reason as Carrie. He widened the scope of stories it could tell. Carrie quickly became one of the most commonly recurring side characters in the show, especially on Halloween episodes. Whenever the show needed something magic or paranormal to happen, Carrie was right there. It helped that Carrie was one of the few students to have an initial personality that actually stuck with her. Emo, why fix what ain't broke? It's just dead, like many emos wish they were. But as the show went on, the show started using Carrie more with Darwin, the most wholesome character in the show. Then, one of the writers turned into a Tumblr user under the light of a full moon, their weight multiplying in seconds, a neck beard growing out of nowhere, their hair turned a variety of inhuman colors, and they let out a non-mammalian cry of, "I ship it!" With the show focusing so much on Gumball and Penny's relationship, it didn't seem like the writers had any interest in giving Darwin a love interest. They tried once and forgot about her. But I guess someone realized that Darwin and Carrie actually complement each other, and they wound up turning it into a canonical thing. Like Eileen, Carrie imperceptibly went from a side character to a love interest of one of the main characters. Not much really changed about how they handled Carrie after this, but it did serve to boost her profile. But Darwin wasn't the only member of the Watterson family to get a partner of some kind. There's Granny JoJo, who, like Carrie, was one of the most recurring side characters for ages. Then came the season 3 episode, The Man, in which she got a boyfriend, Louie. Not that significant to development, you'd think, but unlike most cases of this plot in any other show, Louie was a pre-existing character. He usually appeared among an ensemble of senior citizens in the show up to this point. Pretty insignificant bunch, notable only for their status as a group. Marvin was the only one to appear on his own. Louie's only significance came from being part of a group, until they established that he was Granny JoJo's boyfriend, because following that, Louie had chances to develop a personality on his own. He began regularly appearing without the other seniors, and to punctuate his new role, they didn't forget that he was Granny JoJo's boyfriend. He even married her a season after the introduction of their relationship. Even Richard's dad coming back didn't cause Louie to stop appearing. Yeah, it's another case of a character becoming more prominent by virtue of being a love interest. I just wanted to bring up this case because Louie did something insanely rare for side characters. He was introduced as part of a group and really took on a life of his own outside that group, after not being significant previously. You really don't see that much in cartoons. The only case I can think of is Swindle from Transformers, so I thought I'd mention that. Finally, for the most notable case of an ascended extra from Gumball, how about we consider Rob? Not to be confused with Banana Bob or Bobbert. They're not that similar, but they've technically got the same name. Rob was the absolute definition of a background character in his first appearance, because you see, he was a character in the background. The script was written when I was off the clock, so you can rest easy knowing I wasn't paid to write that. Rob was so unimportant, they changed his design and nobody noticed. So insignificant that his insignificance was the subject of the only jokes about him. Then in season 3, they decided to have a little fun and made Rob the subject of a background story in the episode The Void that was followed up explicitly in The Nobody. Rob got a new design, new motivation, new personality, and a new role. The show's main villain. Multiple storylines spanning different episodes were focused on Rob and his efforts as a villain. 2 different season finales were focused squarely on Rob as the villain. There's a lot to say about Rob as a character, probably worth its own episode. But if you want an example of a side character becoming more significant, how about becoming the main stinking villain of the entire show? Look no further than Rob. So what does this tell us? What are some commonalities between all these characters and how they rose to prominence? Honestly, not much. Each and every one of these stories started because some writer behind some desk came up with an idea, thought it was cool, and everyone else in the room agreed with them. I guess in itself that's pretty rare. Groups of writers agree about as much as Cold War America and Soviet Russia. But the main commonality on display is that a writer took a character, looked at them, and saw potential. And that's important because potential is something not everyone has. I don't care what your mother says, some people are just lost causes. A character is only as good as the person writing them makes them. Sometimes it's nice to see some variety from a show, nice to see more characters from a world, and nice to watch someone living the human dream and becoming important. This has been Cartoon Gateway, and don't forget that I'm your host, David Hollander. Tune in next time where we won't answer your burning questions like, does Ghost Rider have life insurance, and is there a bigger waste of money?
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.